Congratulations, Santi. This is so well deserved. So before getting to Santiago's work, I just want to step back and talk about how crime and violence touches us at every level. So for starters, just think about the level of a country. Think about an issue like national security. In the United States, the flow of guns and migrants and drugs and criminal groups over the southern border is right now probably the single greatest national security issue facing our country. And in Colombia, with peace comes a new challenge, that of powerful cartels with their drugs and their violence and their political corruption. So that's one level. Now think about maybe a level one down, just a little bit. Think about us as citizens and the kind of society we want to live in. Mass incarceration is another tremendous challenge facing both Colombia and the United States and other countries. On the one hand, we want a secure society and we want to deter people from committing crimes. We want to be in a society where injustice is punished. But we also know that imprisonment is not always equally applied. It's not always just. The system is not always just, nor is it necessarily effective. Now drop down another level still, just to the city you live in, or even the street you walk down in the evening. Most of us, at some point, maybe every night, will have a feeling of fear or apprehension, some risk of attack or getting robbed or assaulted. It may be very small or it may be very acute. And sometimes that's at the back of our minds and sometimes at the front, but nonetheless, it's occupying, it's even oppressive. I often feel this in Chicago. I can feel it near my home. I'm sure you have all felt it in Colombia as well. And this might be the most common way that some of us feel what it's like to be insecure, even on a small level. And so speaking personally, and I think for Santiago, once you start to think about these problems of justice and violence and insecurity, it's really hard to think about anything else. And yet, I think I'm also not alone in feeling a bit paralyzed because, it's hard to know what we're supposed to do about it. The fixes, to the extent we have any, all seem to have unintended consequences. None of them clearly work that well. The average cop or police chief or judge or mayor or president, if they're being honest with themselves, they don't really know what to do. And I think this is where Santiago's work comes in, not just for Colombia, but really for the world, for any mayor or any judge or any mayor or president or cop or police chief who wants a solution. His work so far and his work in future is really to give us better tools to address all of these problems: a more secure nation, a more just society, a safer and more peaceful everyday existence. And clearly this is something we direly need. So let me give a couple of examples, and I'll start with some work, drawing on some work that he did with Daniel Mejia and Daniel Ortega, tackling this problem of feeling insecure on the street. One of his early projects was looking at policing in Medellin, whether having, very basic question, whether having more police on the highest crime corners could make the city safer. This makes a lot of sense. Cities are constantly looking for ways to use the resources they have more effectively. And this strategy that he looked at, called hotspots policing, seemed to be a best practice from places like the United States, where there's this huge, in some sense, it's the most dominant form of policing. And so Santiago and the Daniels tested it out with a huge randomized control trial. Then when Daniel Mejia became Secretary of Security in Bogota, they tried it there and they asked me to help study it. And I think what we saw over this little odyssey of ours is that this is something that made crime a bit better, maybe not a lot, and maybe it just moved some of the crime around. Maybe some really serious violence was averted. It was, I think, a much more effective way to use the city's resources. But for me, the lesson was pretty clear, which is that we need to do better. We need to have better tools. And this is true, frankly, of what I think most of what criminology has given us so far. A bunch of intuitive, reasonable tools. They all have solid evidence, and they all sort of solidly show that they reduce crime a little. It's a little bit mediocre in some ways, and that's the sad state of the world. And I think that's how, and Santiago is pushing against that. He's trying to help us do better. He's shown this I think, in also how we punish criminals. He has an amazing dissertation on prisons and prison reform. He noticed that when Colombia built new and less crowded prisons, the people who got sent to the better prisons didn't look any different before, whether they went to the new, better, less crowded, or the old, decrepit ones. But afterwards, the ones that had been sent to the better and less crowded prisons with the better conditions were far less likely to commit crimes after they were released and far less likely to go back to prison. And so it's not just that he showed that mass incarceration, again, our knee-jerk response that we do all of the time, it's not just he showed that this is a mediocre solution, that it doesn't really do its job, but he also showed that when we're satisfied with the mediocre, we might even get the opposite of what we want to achieve. And we can do better. We can do better by having less crowded prison conditions, and we can think daring thoughts, like maybe we should have much lower rates of incarceration, much fewer sentences, and so on. These are some of the important implications that his work points us to, that we have to care about prison conditions and the rates of incarceration, not just because we want a just country or because a society is judged by how it treats its criminals, which is all true, but because we undermine our own objectives of law and order when we fail. Now, as the final example, I want to pull up to a much more of a national issue, one of organized crime and what a serious challenge this is to society. Because if mayors and police chiefs feel unsure how to best reduce regular crime, the ones who are confronting organized crime are at even greater loss for options. This is a huge sector of really every country's economy. It's drug production and wholesale and retail. It's the selling of protection, it's smuggling, it's gambling, prostitutions, numbers rackets, labor racketeering, and on and on and on. And being a policymaker in this space is a little bit like being an industry regulator, except instead of being asked to regulate oil or tech, as a policymaker, you're supposed to regulate businesses in this clandestine sector. And that's challenging because unlike the oil regulator or the tech regulator or the medical regulator, you don't know who the firms are. You don't know who runs them. You don't know how much they make. You don't know what their incentives are. All this info is usually scarce or unclear or out of date. Sometimes it's completely absent. You also can't engage with them, at least not legally. And even if you could, even if you had this information, even if you could directly engage with them, you're not even sure what you can do to change their incentives. The average mayors and presidents and ministers of security and police chiefs have really just one big tool at their disposal, and they use it again and again and again. They crack down on these organized criminals. They try to arrest as many as possible, and maybe that stops them running their gangs and their mafias, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it shrinks their size, or maybe more people just come in to replace them. And often we don't really know, but clearly we need answers. And once again, Santiago's work is really trying to fill this gap. He's trying to develop new tools and test them out. This is actually something, in many cases, he and I have been doing together in Medellin. We're trying to find out ways that governments can do things like crowd gangs out and crowd organized crime out from selling protection, from extortion, and so on and so on. And this to me is really what's so impressive about Santiago. Not that he's out there trying to test tools, but that he's trying to come up with better ones. And I can say, the work really brings out his strengths and why it's so, it's been so fabulous for me to work with him. Not just a passion for public service, which is there, and a talent for understanding and talking to decision makers, but also an amazingly open mind, a deep creativity, and a cleverness that makes me really hopeful about the solutions out there for a Colombia or a Chicago. And that's made this one of the most rewarding professional relationships of my career. I can't say that Santiago is my best co-author because I married my first co-author, and we've been writing papers and raising children for 14 years. So he's not number one, but you're way up there. Number two is a good place in that hierarchy, I hope. And I hope 14 years from now, it's still as close or even a closer friendship and professional collaboration as it's been up to now. So congratulations again, Santiago. It's much deserved.